The Pacific, Bougainville Island. November 1st, 1943, 0400 hours. The jungle breathed in the darkness. Thick, suffocating humidity wrapped around everything like a wet blanket, and the air smelled of rotting vegetation and volcanic soil. In the pre-dawn blackness of Bougainville's interior, Japanese observation posts sat hidden among the banyan trees, their field glasses trained on the American beachhead at Cape Torquena. The officers had watched the Marines land the day before, chaotic, bloody, predictable. Now they waited for what always came next, weeks of digging in, fortifying positions, the slow crawl inland. This was how island warfare worked. This was the rhythm of the Pacific. They had seen it at Guadalcanal, at New Georgia. The Americans would pause now. They would consolidate. They would take their time. But as the first gray light crept over the horizon, something was wrong. Through the binoculars, a Japanese lieutenant saw movement. Not the cautious probing of infantry, but something else entirely. Trucks, dozens of them. Bulldozers rolling off landing craft directly onto the beach. Men in different uniforms, not Marines, moving with industrial precision across terrain that had been impenetrable jungle just hours before. He watched confused as an entire section of rainforest simply disappeared. Trees that stood for centuries fell in coordinated waves, dragged aside by machinery that seemed to devour the landscape. By noon, the jungle was gone. By sunset, the lieutenant was staring at something that should not exist. A flat, graded rectangle of crushed coral, nearly a mile long, carved into the heart of Bougainville like a scar. By the following morning, American fighters were landing on it. The Japanese High Command, when they received a report, did not believe it. They demanded confirmation. Their engineers estimated it would take 6 weeks minimum to build an operational airfield on Bougainville, and that assumed favorable conditions, which the island's swamps and volcanic terrain decidedly did not provide. The Americans had done it in 40 hours. This was not an anomaly. This was doctrine. What the Japanese army witnessed at Bougainville was a machinery of American engineering warfare, a system so vast, so logistically coordinated, so incomprehensibly rapid that it shattered every assumption Imperial Japan had made about their enemy. The Americans did not simply fight with soldiers. They fought with bulldozers, with graders, with crushed coral and Marston matting and portable generators. They fought with an industrial system that could conjure air bases from nothingness, that could turn mud into runways, that could rebuild what had been destroyed faster than the Japanese could destroy it again. This was not the war the Emperor's officers had prepared for. This was not the war they understood. In 1941, when Japanese war planners designed Operation Z, their code name for surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, they made careful calculations about American industrial capacity. They knew the United States had factories, shipyards, steel mills. They knew America was rich. But wealth, they believed, made men soft. A nation addicted to comfort, to automobiles and refrigerators and luxury, could not have the warrior spirit to endure a prolonged Pacific War. The Japanese soldier was disciplined, ascetic, willing to die for the emperor. The American soldier, they assumed, would break when deprived of his conveniences. This was a gamble. Strike hard, expand fast, make the cost of reconquest so high that America would negotiate a settlement rather than endure years of jungle warfare. The assumption had a certain logic. Japanese soldiers in China had endured conditions that would destroy most armies. Starvation rations, no medical care, diseases that killed more men than bullets. They had learned to survive on discipline and ideology. When Japanese infantry landed in the Philippines and Malaya, in the Dutch East Indies, they moved fast and light, cutting through colonial defenders who were tied to roads and supply lines. Japanese engineers were skilled, resourceful, capable of building bridges from bamboo and constructing fortifications from local materials. But their doctrine was fundamentally defensive. Once territory was taken, they dug in, they fortified. They waited for the enemy to come to them, to bleed against prepared positions. Time, they believed, was on their side. The Americans arrived with a different philosophy entirely. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Navy's construction battalions, the Seabees, did not see the Pacific Islands as obstacles. They saw them as construction sites. Before the war, America had built the Hoover Dam, the Golden Gate Bridge, entire highway system spanning a continent. The same engineering corps that had reshaped the American landscape now turned that capability toward warfare. They did not adapt to the jungle. They removed it. They did not work around terrain. They rebuilt it. At Guadalcanal in 1942, Henderson Field became the prototype. The Marines seized a partially completed Japanese airstrip in August, and within days, American engineers had operational. The Japanese, entrenched in the jungle, watched as 47 transports landed, unloaded supplies, and took off again, a logistical umbilical cord that made the American perimeter almost impossible to starve out. Japanese commanders threw everything they had at Henderson Field. Artillery bombardments, naval shelling, nighttime banzai charges directly at the runway. They understood viscerally that this single airstrip was a hinge of the entire campaign. If they could destroy it, cut that supply line, the Marines would wither. But every morning, the airfield was operational again. Bomb craters filled overnight with crushed coral, damaged Marston matting, interlocking steel planks that could be laid down like a jigsaw puzzle, replaced in hours. Wrecked aircraft pushed aside by bulldozers, new ones flying in by afternoon. The Japanese broke themselves against Henderson Field in a months-long siege, and the runway never stopped functioning. A Japanese major, captured later in the campaign, was interrogated about what he had witnessed. He described the American engineers with something close to awe. "We thought if we damaged the airfield, it would take weeks to repair," he said. But every morning, it was as if nothing had happened. We could not understand how this was possible. The answer was not courage. It was not tactics. It was logistics on a scale that Imperial Japan had never conceived. Behind every American advance across the Pacific moved a logistics train of staggering size. For every combat soldier landing on a beachhead, there were multiple support personnel: engineers, mechanics, supply clerks, medical staff. For every fighter squadron that flew missions, there were entire units dedicated to building and maintaining the runways they launched from. The U.S. military did not just transport supplies to the front lines. It transported the entire industrial base. Prefabricated structures shipped in crates, portable hospitals, water purification systems, electrical generators powerful enough to light entire encampments, and above all, machinery, bulldozers, graders, cranes, earth-moving equipment that turned terrain into infrastructure. The Seabees embodied this philosophy completely. Formed in 1942, the Naval Construction Battalions recruited men not from traditional military backgrounds, but from civilian trades: carpenters, electricians, heavy equipment operators, men who had built roads and dams and bridges in peacetime. They were trained to fight if necessary, but their primary weapon was the bulldozer. Their motto, "We build, we fight," was literal. On islands like Tarawa, Seabees landed alongside Marines, often under fire, and began grading runways while skirmishes still raged inland. On Peleliu, they carved an airstrip from coral reef, so hard it dulled bulldozer blades, working in heat that reached 115 degrees, surrounded by rotting bodies and the stench of death. And they did it in days. The Japanese had nothing comparable. Their engineering units were skilled at fortification, bunkers, tunnels, interlocking defensive positions that turned islands like Iwo Jima into subterranean fortresses. But construction at speed, logistics at scale, the ability to project industrial power forward into hostile territory, this was not part of their doctrine. When Japanese positions were destroyed, they stayed destroyed. When American positions were destroyed, they reappeared. At Saipan in 1944, Japanese forces managed to destroy a partially completed American airfield with a nighttime artillery barrage. Japanese commanders celebrated. They had bought themselves time. Aerial reconnaissance the next morning showed the runway operational, with American bombers already using it to strike targets in the Marianas. The bombardment had occurred at midnight. By dawn, engineers had filled the craters, relayed the matting, and restored functionality. 12 hours. This created a psychological effect that no amount of battlefield valor could overcome. Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated to believe in spiritual strength over material wealth, found themselves facing an enemy for whom material wealth was a weapon. The Americans did not need to be better jungle fighters. They did not need to match Japanese infantry in close combat endurance. They simply built a runway, flew in supplies, and turned every captured island into an unsinkable aircraft carrier. The jungle, the heat, the disease, these were obstacles that American engineering neutralized with machinery and logistics. There was a recording object that appeared again and again in Japanese officers' diaries and captured documents from the latter half of the war. The sound of bulldozers, not gunfire, not aircraft, bulldozers. The mechanical grinding of diesel engines and steel blades reshaping the earth, audible through the jungle day and night. On islands where Japanese garrisons were cut off, starving, reduced to eating grass and roots, they could hear the Americans building roads, airstrips, entire base complexes. The sound became a symbol of something deeper than battlefield defeat. It was a sound of abundance, of industrial excess, of a nation that could afford to ship heavy machinery across an ocean just to move dirt faster. One Japanese soldier, recovering in an American POW camp on Guam, watched Seabees construct a new hospital building in a single afternoon. Prefabricated walls bolted together, roof panels lifted by crane, electrical wiring run through conduits, plumbing connected to a water system that delivered hot showers. He had spent 2 years in the Imperial Army eating rice mixed with weevils, sleeping in muddy foxholes, watching his comrades die from infected wounds because there were no antibiotics. Now he watched Americans build a hospital faster than he could have dug a proper trench. He wrote in a journal that was later recovered, "We were told they were weak. We were told their wealth made them soft. But wealth is strength. We did not understand this." The transformation in perception was total. Japanese propaganda had painted Americans as decadent, corrupted by materialism, lacking the spiritual purity to endure hardship. But what the soldiers experienced was an enemy who brought his entire civilization with him to the battlefield. The Americans did not endure hardship. They eliminated it. They did not suffer deprivation. They airlifted an ice cream. There are documented instances of Seabees constructing ice cream plants on Pacific islands, not as frivolity, but as a morale calculation. A nation that could afford to manufacture frozen desserts in the middle of a jungle war was sending a message. We have so much, we can waste it. At Okinawa, the final island battle before the planned invasion of Japan, the scale reached its apex. Engineers landed and began constructing not just airfields, but entire port facilities, harbors dredged, piers extended, fuel depots established. Within weeks, Okinawa had more functional infrastructure than it had possessed before the war. Japanese defenders dug into caves and tunnels, watched American supply ships arrive in an unending stream. Liberty ships, tankers, troop transports, hospital ships, dozens visible on the horizon at any given time. A captured Japanese officer was taken aboard an American supply vessel and asked to estimate its cargo capacity. He guessed 2,000 tons. The actual capacity was 10,000 tons, and it was one of hundreds. This was the war Japan could not win, not because of tactics, not because of valor, but because the Americans had turned logistics into a weapon system more devastating than any battleship. They could lose battles, and it did not matter. They could lose ships, aircraft, entire regiments, and replace them faster than Japan could inflict casualties. The industrial base of the United States, mobilized, coordinated, projected across the Pacific, was an existential threat that no amount of Bushido could counter. In the end, the airfields themselves became symbolic. Every island the Americans took became a link in a chain, each airstrip extending the range of bombers one step closer to the Japanese home islands. Engineers built them in sequence: Guadalcanal, Bougainville, the Marshalls, the Marianas, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each one appeared impossibly fast, each one unsinkable, each one a staging ground for the next assault. By 1945, 29 superfortresses were launching from runways that had been jungle or coral reef just months before, flying to Japan and back, dropping incendiaries on cities that had believed themselves beyond reach. The Japanese High Command, in the final months of the war, understood what had defeated them. It was not Midway. It was not Hiroshima. It was the bulldozers. It was the engineers who could rebuild an airfield overnight. It was a logistical system that made every American advance irreversible, every captured island a permanent forward base. They had fought a 20th century war with a 19th century understanding of logistics, and they had been crushed not by soldiers, but by supply chains. The final reflection. There's a photograph from 1945, taken on Okinawa just after Japanese surrender. In the foreground, a Seabee bulldozer sits idle, its blade caked with dried coral. In the background, rows of B-29 bombers are parked on a runway that had not existed 6 months earlier. The image captures something essential about American power in the Second World War. Not the violence of the bombers, but the quiet, mechanical certainty of the bulldozer, the tool that built faster than the enemy could destroy. Wars are not won by men willing to die. They are won by nations capable of building. The Japanese soldier was brave, disciplined, willing to endure unimaginable suffering for his emperor. But he was defeated by an enemy who did not need to endure. The American engineer, with his bulldozer and his crushed coral and his prefabricated matting, represented a different kind of strength, the strength of abundance, of industrial democracy, of a system that could project overwhelming material power to the farthest corners of the earth and make it look effortless. The Japanese expected the Americans to break under hardship. Instead, the Americans brought the hardware store, and in doing so, they revealed a fundamental truth about modern warfare. The side that can rebuild faster than the enemy can destroy will always, inevitably prevail. The sound of those bulldozers, grinding through jungle night after night, was not just construction. It was inevitability made audible. It was the sound of a war already won.